Some people walk into a crowded room and feel energy, but for others it feels like the air itself disappears. The noise becomes heavier than sound. Conversations blur into a restless ocean of voices. Bodies move too close. Eyes glance for a second too long, and suddenly, something deep inside you whispers a quiet command. Leave. Not because you hate people, not because you're rude or antisocial, but because something inside you feels overwhelmed in a way you can't fully explain. If this feeling sounds familiar, there's a good chance the problem isn't the crowd itself. The crowd is just a mirror. The real story usually began much earlier, long before the busy streets, packed malls, or loud gatherings ever entered your life. Psychologists sometimes describe the mind as a kind of emotional radar. Some people are born with a radar that scans gently. Others carry a radar so sensitive it notices everything: the tension in someone's voice, the subtle shift in someone's expression, the invisible currents of emotion moving through a room. When that radar is too sensitive, crowded places stop feeling like gatherings. They start feeling like storms. Every laugh, every argument, every movement becomes another wave hitting the nervous system. And while most people barely notice these waves, a highly aware mind absorbs them all at once. But sensitivity alone isn't usually the whole story. Often, it begins with something far quieter, something psychologists call microtrauma. Not the kind of trauma that makes headlines, not dramatic moments that people easily recognize. Microtrauma is different. It's subtle, repeated, almost invisible. It's the child who grew up in a home where voices suddenly turned loud without warning. The child who learned to read the room carefully because peace could disappear at any moment. The child who discovered early that safety depended on awareness. Over time, the brain adapts. It sharpens its senses. It becomes an expert at detecting emotional shifts before they happen. This survival skill works beautifully in quiet environments. But in crowded spaces, the brain starts scanning hundreds of signals at once, and suddenly the nervous system feels like a computer with too many tabs open. Your heart beats faster, your breathing changes. Your body prepares for a threat that may not even exist. From the outside, people might simply say, "You're just shy," or "You need to socialize more." But inside, something far more complicated is happening, because crowds don't just bring people. They bring unpredictability. And unpredictability is something the nervous system of a hyper-aware person struggles to tolerate. Imagine standing beside an invisible wall between you and the rest of the crowd. You can see everyone laughing, talking, enjoying the moment. But instead of feeling part of the experience, you feel like an observer. Almost like you're watching life through glass. And the longer you stay, the more your mind begins whispering strange questions. Where do I stand? Am I blocking someone? Did that person just look at me? Am I supposed to say something? These questions may seem small, but together they create a quiet mental storm. Psychologists sometimes link this to something called social overstimulation, when the brain receives more emotional and sensory information than it can comfortably process. But there's another layer hiding beneath it, a deeper psychological phenomenon known as emotional vigilance. Emotional vigilance happens when someone spends years unconsciously monitoring the emotional climate around them. It often develops in childhood environments where love existed. But emotional safety was unpredictable. Maybe affection was warm, one moment, distant the next. Maybe mistakes were met with sudden criticism. Maybe approval always felt conditional. In environments like this, the brain learns a powerful lesson: pay attention to everything. So, it does. It watches. It listens. It scans. It analyzes. By adulthood, this habit becomes automatic. The mind reads faces like books, interprets tones like secret codes, and senses tension before anyone says a word. This ability can make someone deeply empathetic. But in crowded places, empathy can become overwhelming, because suddenly you're not just feeling your own emotions, you're feeling fragments of everyone else's. The loud laughter from one group, the awkward silence from another, the subtle irritation in someone's voice nearby. Your nervous system absorbs it all, like an emotional sponge in a flooded room. This is why crowded places can feel exhausting long before anything actually happens. It's not the number of people. It's the number of emotional signals your brain is trying to decode simultaneously. And then there's another invisible force quietly amplifying the discomfort, something psychologists call the spotlight effect. This is the strange mental illusion where we believe people are noticing us far more than they actually are. In crowded spaces, this illusion grows stronger. Suddenly, it feels like every movement might be observed, every small mistake might be noticed, every silence might look awkward. So the mind starts monitoring itself just as intensely as it monitors the room. Now your brain is doing two exhausting jobs at once, watching everyone and watching yourself. It becomes a loop of self-awareness that slowly drains your mental energy. This is why many people who dislike crowded places often feel perfectly calm when they're alone or with one or two trusted people, because in smaller spaces, the emotional radar finally gets to rest. There are fewer signals, fewer variables, fewer invisible calculations running in the background, but something even more fascinating happens beneath all of this, because sometimes the discomfort in crowded places isn't just about sensitivity or overstimulation. Sometimes it's connected to a quiet psychological experience called ambiguous belonging, a subtle feeling that you exist near people, but not fully among them. You might laugh at the same jokes, stand in the same room, participate in the same conversations, but internally, something feels slightly disconnected, like everyone else received an invisible map for navigating social spaces, and somehow yours went missing. This feeling doesn't mean you're broken. It often means your mind developed differently in response to your environment. But here's where the story becomes even more interesting, because the very thing that makes crowded places uncomfortable for you might actually be the result of a powerful survival strategy your brain learned years ago. A strategy that once protected you. A strategy that kept you emotionally safe. And once you understand what that strategy is, something about your relationship with crowds, and even with yourself, may begin to change in ways you never expected. And once you understand what that strategy is, something begins to soften inside you. Because the truth is, avoiding crowded places was never a weakness. It was protection. Your brain simply learned that distance equals safety. When the environment becomes loud, unpredictable, emotionally saturated, your nervous system quietly pulls you away from the storm, not to isolate you from the world, but to regulate the overload. In psychology, this response is often connected to something called nervous system regulation. Your mind isn't acting people. It's trying to restore balance. Like a sensitive smoke detector that reacts even to a small flame, your inner alarm activates early, sometimes earlier than necessary. But here's where the hidden consequence appears. When someone repeatedly escapes overstimulating environments, life can slowly start shrinking. Invitations become maybe next time. Busy events turn into quiet evenings at home. Opportunities that involve unfamiliar groups begin to feel exhausting before they even begin. At first, this feels like relief, and in many cases, it truly is helpful. Solitude can be incredibly healing for sensitive minds. But over time, something subtle can happen. The brain starts associating crowds not just with discomfort, but with danger. And once the mind labels something as dangerous, it becomes even more vigilant the next time it appears. This creates a quiet cycle. Crowds create overwhelm. Overwhelm leads to avoidance. Avoidance strengthens the fear, until eventually even normal social environments start feeling heavier than they should. But here's the shift that changes everything. What if the goal isn't to force yourself to love crowded places? What if the goal is simply to understand your sensitivity instead of fighting it? Because sensitivity is not a flaw in the human system. In many ways, it's one of the mind's most powerful abilities. Sensitive people notice details others miss. They read emotions before they're spoken. They sense tension in a room before conflict even begins. These abilities create incredible empathy, creativity, and emotional intelligence. The problem only appears when the brain believes it must stay on guard all the time. Healing begins when that guard slowly learns it doesn't need to work so hard anymore. And this doesn't happen through pressure. It happens through gentleness. Sometimes the first step is simply changing how you approach crowded spaces. Instead of forcing yourself to endure hours of noise and stimulation, you allow yourself small exposures. 10 minutes in a busy cafe, a short walk through a lively market, standing near the edge of a gathering rather than the center. These small experiences send a new message to the nervous system. This environment is not a threat. Another powerful shift happens when you give your mind something grounding to hold on to, your breath. The feeling of your feet against the ground. The quiet awareness that not every face in the room is evaluating you. Because the truth is, most people in crowded places are doing the exact same thing you are. They're worrying about themselves. The spotlight you feel shining on you is usually an illusion. And slowly, very slowly, the invisible wall you once felt between you and the world begins to fade. You start noticing moments you missed before, a stranger smiling at their friend. The quiet rhythm of conversations blending together, the realization that crowds are not one overwhelming entity, but hundreds of individual stories unfolding at once. And sometimes when you step back and observe it this way, something surprising happens. The crowd stops feeling like a storm. It starts feeling like an ocean, vast, unpredictable, full of movement, but no longer something that must drown you. You are simply standing at the shore, choosing how close you want to step into the waves. And that choice is the most important part, because healing isn't about becoming someone who thrives in chaos. It's about becoming someone who understands their own mind deeply enough to move through the world without fear of it. So if crowded places have always made you feel different, overwhelmed, or quietly out of place, maybe the truth is simpler than you think. Maybe your mind just learned to listen too carefully to the noise of the world, and now it's learning something new, how to listen to itself. And if this story resonated with something inside you, if it gave words to a feeling you could never quite explain, then remember this: you were never strange for feeling overwhelmed by the noise. You were simply a mind that learned to feel deeply in a world that often moves too loudly. And minds like that are not broken, they're rare. If this quiet realization spoke to you tonight, you are not alone on this journey. And sometimes the first step toward understanding ourselves is simply hearing our story reflected back to us.